There's a dead man's face hidden in this armor. Fans believe they can see it, sewn into the pauldron, staring back at you from the chaos of the battle surrounding it, if you know where to look. The research can't confirm it. The artist hasn't said. But that ambiguity is the point, because the painting rewards the kind of sustained, reverent attention that most commercial illustration never earns. The painting is the Emperor versus Horus. It's widely attributed to Adrian Smith. That attribution lives in community consensus, not in a Games Workshop credit line, so carry that caveat with you. The piece dates to roughly 1990, give or take the imprecision of a community trying to reconstruct its own history. What's not in dispute is what it looks like. Two figures locked in a mythological collision, rendered with the weight and density of something that belongs on a church wall rather than in a game manual. The color palette is the deep burgundy and gold of old illuminated manuscripts. The figures aren't heroic in the clean commercial sense. They're tormented. They're suffering even in the victor. The background doesn't recede into clean perspective. It accumulates, pressing forward, crowded with implication. One commenter, in a thread about classic Warhammer art, reached for the most extreme comparison available. Catholic Church mural vibes, he wrote, like the Sistine Chapel if we worshipped the Emperor today. That comment got 149 likes. Not because it's hyperbole, because it's accurate. The last video that showed you this painting didn't name the artist. This one will. And it won't stop at one name. John Blanche was born in 1948. He first contributed art to Games Workshop in 1977, the year British punk detonated. The Sex Pistols released Never Mind the Bollocks that October, and somewhere in the same cultural moment, a young artist was supplying cover art for issue 4 of White Dwarf magazine. When Games Workshop relocated its headquarters to Nottingham in 1986, Blanche was appointed art director. He held that position for 37 years. He retired on 31st May 2023 at age 75 after 46 years at the company. No successor has been officially named. That is the biographical skeleton. The flesh is stranger and more important. Blanche didn't approach Warhammer's visual world through the lens of art school orthodoxy or Renaissance imitation. The Goblin Co. tribute published at his retirement describes him as having been instrumental in adding punk and metal into the gaming world so that things weren't just so fucking dorky. That's editorial language from the Goblin Co. retirement tribute, not a direct Blanche quote, but a characterization that lines up precisely with the documented evidence of his actual career. In January 1988, roughly 2 years into his tenure as art director, he painted the cover of a thrash metal album. The band was Sabbath, British thrash metal. The album was History of a Time to Come. The cover art was titled, Horned is the Hunter. Wikipedia's entry on the album notes that the artwork was drawn by the band's White Dwarf contact, meaning the commission ran directly through GW infrastructure. This wasn't a moonlighting gig with no connection to his day job. The metal world and the Warhammer world were the same world, staffed by the same person. The sacred quality of classic Warhammer art came from a punk rocker who was simultaneously painting thrash metal album covers. Every instinct says these things shouldn't produce something that looks like the Sistine Chapel. The instinct is wrong. To understand why, you have to understand where Blanche was drawing from, and it wasn't Florence. He described it himself in a 2009 interview with the Goblin Co. blog. History is fascinating, he said. I constantly find that real life is far more bizarre, far weirder than what you can conjure up with your own mind. When he elaborated on the specific tradition he felt Warhammer inhabited, he reached past the Renaissance entirely. In fact, the resonance isn't just history, or the history of Western Europe, he said, but it echoes through our past, right back to Paleolithic times. It's a very Northern European thing. Northern European, not Italian, not the Sistine ceiling with its athletic, idealized bodies ascending in perfect anatomical proportion. Something older, something that was painting grotesque figures long before Michelangelo was born, and which never stopped. Hieronymus Bosch completed the Garden of Earthly Delights around 1500. Peter Bruegel the Elder was painting peasants and apocalyptic landscapes in the mid-16th century. The Gothic manuscript tradition that preceded them both had been filling sacred texts with creatures that looked like nothing in nature. Hybrid beasts, contorted saints, architectural nightmares in the margins. This was a visual tradition rooted not in idealization, but in the terror and complexity of existence. It didn't make the sacred feel beautiful. It made it feel true and vast and dangerous. Bosch's triptychs are devotional objects that contain hell. You pray in front of them and you don't feel comforted. You feel implicated. That's the lineage Blanche was working in. Not consciously citing Bosch in every brushstroke, but drawing from the same Northern European well. The instinct that real life is grotesque, that history is brutal, that sacred things should carry weight rather than light. The punk and metal aesthetic of the 1970s and 1980s was, at its visual core, a revival of precisely this tradition. The imagery that ran through Iron Maiden's album covers, through the album art that filled independent record shops in Britain in the early 1980s, rotting figures, cosmic horror, medieval allegory in modern clothes, wasn't arbitrary. It was a working-class rediscovery of the Northern grotesque, stripped of academic framing and made visceral again. Blanche understood this pipeline intuitively. He built Warhammer's visual world on top of it for 37 years, and he did so by arguing, the community believes, with the people who wanted to pull it toward the light. Here is what that stubbornness produced on the page. There's a painting, fan-documented, specific publication origin untraced in the research record, that shows troops pouring from the feet of a titan, not standing beside it, not marching in formation near it, pouring from it like blood from a wound, like water from a broken vessel, the scale of the machine so overwhelming that the human figures become texture rather than subject. The titan isn't heroic, it's geological. The army at its base is simultaneously vast and insignificant. There's no compositional instinct here toward reassurance, no clean sightline toward victory, no triumphant posture. Just the weight of industrialized war rendered in a visual language that Bruegel would have recognized. Then there's another image that circulates in these discussions. Fan-documented, its specific publication origin similarly untraced. A warship framed against the eye of terror. A vessel the size of a city, caught in the light of a wound in space. The eye of terror in classic Warhammer art isn't a clean special effect. It's painted with the same accumulated density as everything else in this tradition, dark and complex, and somehow ancient feeling despite its science fiction setting. The ship and the void around it carry a specific quality of sacred dread. You're looking at something that knows it might not come back. The art tells you that without a caption. This is what Blanche's aesthetic philosophy produced in practice. Work that didn't meet you halfway. Work that required sustained attention and rewarded it with discovery. What fans have identified as a face in the Emperor versus Horus pauldron, real or imagined, and the specific identity of whose face it might be is itself speculation, is the perfect emblem of this approach. Even the uncertainty of whether it's actually there is part of what makes the painting worth looking at for the third and fourth time. He didn't work alone. Adrian Smith's contribution to this aesthetic should be stated plainly, even with the attribution uncertainty attached. The community has designated the Emperor versus Horus painting as his, with the kind of consistency that usually trails confirmed fact, even when it precedes it. Call it what it is. Widely attributed to Adrian Smith, without a GW credit line to anchor it formally. What the community's instinct recognizes is a standard of craft and psychological weight that matches everything else from this period. One community member describes his output as God-tier gold standard. That's not hyperbole from a fanboy. It's the kind of shorthand that circulates in communities that have been looking at something for 30 years and have developed real critical vocabulary for it. Then there's Ian Miller. In 1989, Games Workshop published Ratspike, a book of artwork co-created by Blanche and Miller. Miller is a British fantasy illustrator whose work inhabits the same grotesque Northern European tradition Blanche drew from, but with his own distinct register, tighter, more architectural, with a scratchy precision that makes his figures look like they're being excavated from stone rather than painted onto canvas. The Ratspite collaboration is evidence that Blanche wasn't operating as a lone visionary sealed in his own aesthetic. He was cultivating an ecosystem of artists who shared the same underlying instincts and elevated each other through proximity and institutional support. A self-described truck driver put it better than any of this analysis does in a comment on a video that failed to credit any of these people. Not a single mention of John Blanche or Anders Zorn, he wrote. I'm a fucking truck driver and have a greater appreciation of art. The Anders Zorn reference is worth pausing on. Zorn was a Swedish painter and etcher who lived from 1860 to 1920, known for a vigorous, unconventional style and a studied rejection of academic orthodoxy. A truck driver citing him alongside John Blanche in a comment about a Warhammer video is information about who Blanche's audience actually is. These aren't children with nostalgia for plastic soldiers. They're people who recognize, intuitively, if not always academically, when they're in the presence of art that connects to a real tradition, and who respond to the failure to acknowledge that tradition with justified anger. The competitor video that generated this comment didn't name Blanche, didn't name Smith, didn't name Miller. The Sistine Chapel comment, the one that got 149 likes, did more naming than the video itself did. Now comes the harder part. Blanche retired on 31st May 2023. Games Workshop hasn't named a successor art director. The community consensus, expressed in comments with varying degrees of elegance, is that something changed, and that the change predates the retirement, tracks with it, and has accelerated since. One viewer wrote, simply, as soon as he stopped making their art, it was over. Another, the art not being as good now is marketing. They want it the same so it's consistent throughout. A third, everything is trying to be Overwatch and Fortnite. No primary GW source document confirms a mandate for digital standardization. No internal policy has surfaced. What has surfaced is the visual record and the community's reading of it. The modern GW aesthetic, brighter, cleaner, smoother, less textured, less dark, is real and visible. Whether it's the product of a deliberate decision or a gradual drift without a guiding personality to arrest, it's harder to establish. The honest answer is probably both, and the honest villain is probably neither GW's malice nor any individual's failure. The honest villain is structural. Blanche held the art director position for 37 years. In an industry where creative directors turn over on 5-year cycles, that's not a tenure. It's a geological formation. His aesthetic wasn't a philosophy that could be documented in a brand guide and handed to a successor. It was an accumulation of arguments won and lost, of specific choices made in specific rooms over 4 decades, of an individual personality that was, by all accounts, not easy to work with and not easy to redirect. The Goblin Co-editorial calls him instrumental to a specific kind of visual bravery. His own stated philosophy, that reality is more bizarre than imagination, that the Northern European inheritance reaches back to Paleolithic times, isn't a style sheet. It's a world view. You can't hire for it. What the community is diagnosing as Overwatch and Fortnite is the visual language of contemporary commercial illustration. Clean, accessible, designed for immediate legibility across platforms, optimized for digital reproduction at thumbnail scale. That's not a moral failure. It's a market response to a changed distribution environment. The art that now needs to sell miniatures is viewed primarily on screens, often small ones, in fast scroll contexts. The deliberate density of classic Warhammer art, the composition that requires you to lean in, the color palette that punishes distraction, is a liability in that context. An aesthetic philosophy demanding no easy access and no fixed criteria is, in distribution terms, a feature that costs money. The part that should make you stop is this: he knew it. That formulation, no easy access, no fixed criteria, isn't a defensive posture. It's a declaration. He knew the work was polarizing. He said so implicitly every time he described his aesthetic as one that didn't accommodate casual attention. He lost some of those internal arguments. He won enough to keep his job for 46 years, which suggests that someone, at least, understood what he was doing. The Gothic punk aesthetic he embedded in Warhammer's DNA carries a specific and irreplaceable weight because it was never designed to be replicable. It emerged from one person's idiosyncratic intersection of Northern European art history, post-war British punk culture, heavy metal aesthetics, and a stated conviction that reality outpaces imagination in its capacity for horror and wonder. You can't reconstruct that intersection by hiring someone with a similar portfolio. The portfolio is the output. The intersection is the person. Return to the Emperor versus Horus painting. Zoom out from whatever that detail in the pauldron is, the face that may or may not be there, whose identity is itself a matter of fan speculation. The mystery that rewards exactly the kind of sustained looking the painting demands. Pull back until you can see the full composition, the dying emperor, the armored enormity of Horus, the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of fictional history compressed into a single painted moment. Whoever made this, and the community's best guess is Adrian Smith, working within an institutional framework that Blanche spent decades building and defending, made something that functions as a religious object for a secular audience. The commenter with the 149 likes wasn't being dramatic. He was describing the experience accurately. The cathedral was built over 46 years, one argumentative brushstroke at a time. The architect was a punk rocker from post-war Britain who believed that Northern European history contained more terror and strangeness than any invented world could match, who painted thrash metal album covers and, by community accounts, argued with those who wanted to pull the aesthetic toward the light, who left on May 31, 2023, at age 75, with no announced successor and no documented plan for what comes next. The walls are very clean now, very bright, very easy to access. Nobody has hidden anything in the armor. Subscribe for more stories like this.